President Donald Trump said he needed more time. For days, he had been weighing whether to join Israel's fight against Iran with a strike on Iran's nuclear facilities. On Thursday, he said he might need 2 weeks to make that decision. But that was apparently a ruse. Strike plans were already in motion. 2 days later, on Saturday, the United States bombed Iran. Here's Trump addressing the nation after that attack.
Iran, the bully of the Middle East, must now make peace. If they do not, future attacks will be far greater and a lot easier.
Trump says the goal was to keep Iran from building a nuclear weapon. He warned Iran not to retaliate. But today, we're already seeing Iran fire back, targeting at least one U.S. military base in the region. This is a fluid situation. But what happens next and how Trump responds will determine whether the U.S. becomes mired in another protracted conflict. From the newsroom of The Washington Post, this is Post Reports. I'm Colby Ekowitz. It's Monday, June 23rd. Earlier today, I spoke with White House reporter Natalie Allison and national security reporter Alex Horton about how the U.S. strike in Iran was carried out and the gamble Trump is making by inserting the U.S. into another possible war in the Middle East. Natalie, Alex, hi. Thanks so much for being here.
Hey, thanks for having us.
Yeah, pleasure to be here.
So, Natalie, it's 10 a.m. Monday morning. Obviously, this is a very fast-moving story. But take me back to the weekend. You see the news. What was your first thought?
There was a lot of surprise among us who had been watching this closely throughout the week and the weekend. You know, Donald Trump had just landed back from being at his golf club in New Jersey, and he, had walked into the White House, and a lid was called. That's the term that the White House uses to tell the press pool that there's not going to be any more events to report on that evening. Typically, it's to tell them that the president isn't going to be going anywhere or there won't be any public events. And a lot of people took that to mean that, it was not the night. Of course, the context here is that the president had said just a couple days before that he was going to wait as many as 2 weeks. But as we'll discuss, there certainly had been plans underway the whole time for this to happen when it did.
And Alex, you cover national security and the military for the Post. So let's just talk about the strike itself. Can you give us kind of a play-by-play of how this all went down over the weekend?
It started some hours before the bombs actually fell with a decoy flight. Some B-2s and their refueling tankers flew west over the Pacific towards Guam. But meanwhile, 7 other B-2 stealth bombers, affectionately known as the Dorito of Death because of its shape like a bat wing, very advanced stealth bomber. 7 of them took off from Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri at midnight. The 7 B-2s flew over the Atlantic with a pretty robust support network of fighter jets, electronic warfare planes, and probably the most important of all, refuelers, which allow the B-2 to stay in the air for long periods of time and refuel without needing to stop. But before they started their attack run to drop some bombs, they had to clear the way of all other kinds of obstacles, fighter jets, air defense networks, radars. So some of the fighter jets accompanying the bombers went ahead of that force, took those targets out, was mindful of other planes, enemy aircraft in the air, and in a way mowed the grass all the way up to these sites.
And so these planes, they get there in the middle of the night and they strike 3 different sites in Iran, right? What did they actually do at these 3 sites?
So the first opening salvo of this whole operation were 2 massive ordnance penetrator bombs, commonly known as bunker busters. They're specifically designed to penetrate deep surface and with a delayed fuse explode something underneath. In this case, at the Fordo facility where the Iranians do uranium enrichment for nuclear material. They dropped the first 2, and then over the course of the next 25 minutes, dropped another dozen there and at a second nuclear facility in Iran. Meanwhile, a submarine in the Gulf fired 24 Tomahawk cruise missiles to strike another target, and those took some time to get there. So those were in the air as the B-2s and other aircraft were heading towards their targets.
And do we know, Alex, were they successful? Did they destroy the targets they were seeking to destroy?
The bombs hit their targets. There was no shot taken on the American planes as far as the Pentagon knows. So that's all good news. That's what we know. What we don't know is what happened underneath those facilities. When you blow up a missile launch pad in Yemen, you know what happened to it pretty quick. When you send a bomb, the tunnel, a couple hundred feet, and then blow up below the surface, it's going to take some time to understand what happened. And it's a more complicated thing than just looking at the surface, because we've already seen the satellite imagery. These are just holes in the side of a mountain. Can't tell anything. So, we did like the big Top Gun blow stuff up and, do like the freeze frame, jump in the air. Yeah, mission accomplished. And then the hard part is knowing what comes next, knowing what kind of effect that had. And it might take some time to understand that. So we have no idea what the effect is or the effect of Iran to continue its program if they have the desire to.
And Natalie, we talked about this a little bit, but I'm really struck by the fact that Trump was saying he was going to wait to make a decision about whether or not he was going to involve the United States in Israel's ongoing strikes in Iran. What was going on behind the scenes here with Trump and his advisors?
I keep thinking back to Wednesday of last week. I was in the White House press pool that day. And for anyone who was following the news that day, Donald Trump made a big to-do about installing 2 new flagpoles on the White House lawn. And he brought the press pool out to the South Lawn and basically was out there talking to us for about 45 minutes. And in between talking about the proper way to erect a flagpole and why this is the greatest flagpole ever, he was, of course, facing questions from us about what he was going to do about Iran, whether to engage in the form of a U.S. military attack on the country.
Have you been answered questions about whether you are moving closer or you believe the U.S. is moving closer to striking Iranian nuclear facilities? Where's your mindset on that?
I can't say that, right? You don't seriously think I'm going to answer that way?
And he was, of course, being very coy about it.
I mean, you don't know that I'm going to even do it. You don't know. I may do it. I may not do it. I mean, nobody knows what I'm going to do. I can tell you.
Little did we know that at that point, the president had already essentially signed off on the attack plans. And on Wednesday, he was continuing to project that he hadn't made a decision yet. In fact, later that day, he explicitly said he hadn't made a decision. And the White House officials would say that was true, that yes, he had signed off on the attacks, but of course he reserved the right to call off the mission until, the final moments. And that is true. But the president at that point, despite saying he wasn't sure which direction he was going to go, now we know that he already had okayed those plans. And on Thursday, there was, of course, the announcement by White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt, where she was reading a statement that the president had dictated directly to her moments before she walked into the press briefing room. And it said that because he thought there was the prospect for significant negotiations, that he was going to wait up to 2 weeks to make a decision. And the White House advisors, of course, tell me over the weekend that was part of the ruse. That was part of the effort by the United States to throw the Iranians off. How well they succeeded with throwing them off, maybe that's something Alex could speak to, but it certainly was part of the effort to keep them on their toes about what they were going to do and, of course, distract them from the looming attack that was going to happen Saturday.
And Natalie, do we know, who was in the president's ear at this time when he's making these decisions?
The president has been hearing from across the ideological spectrum on this. You have on the one hand, of course, the very hawkish pro-Israel people like Mark Levin. He's a well-known conservative commentator who is on Fox News. And on the other end, the former Fox News host Tucker Carlson, who, basically went so far as to criticize Trump's consideration of attacking Iran that he ended up calling the president this past week to apologize because the president had put out essentially some True Social post saying that Tucker Carlson was kooky and he was going too far in his criticisms. We have people on Carlson's side like Steve Bannon and Charlie Kirk who tried to be a bit more diplomatic than Carlson and how they were talking about it, saying they trusted the president's instincts, but, he needs to know that this could be really risky to attack Iran and it could lead us into the type of war that the president has long said he would not get the United States involved in, and which drew a number of new voters into the president's coalition over the last decade because they were against wars like the ones we saw in the Middle East previously.
I did want to note real quick,
Yeah.
that Charlie Kirk, Tucker Carlson camp of conservatives that are skeptical of Middle East entanglement, Defense Secretary Hegseth and, Director of National Intelligence Tulsi Gabbard had come from that same school of being against Middle East conflict and U.S. operations there, and that the U.S. should focus more on things like China and home defense. They come from that camp too, but they're in a very different position now when it comes to their philosophy and how they advise the president, who has made up his mind.
I mean, obviously, they did not persuade him, and he did go ahead and authorize these strikes. Alex, what was the response from the Iranian government this weekend after this occurred?
So, they've already said that, the U.S. should expect a response. Their military said that any attacks on their nuclear facilities would prompt a response, and it described any retaliation as, quote, legitimate self-defense. They've also threatened to close the Strait of Hormuz, which is a pretty narrow passageway that's vital to commercial traffic, especially when it comes to petroleum. So that will have ramifications across the world. And it's important to take stock of Iranian capabilities. It is different in the last few weeks because of the Israeli attacks. They have focused on ways for Iran to project power. That includes ballistic missiles, their launch sites. So Iran's ability to affect consequences on the U.S. and the region is fundamentally different than it was 2-3 months ago. The second thing is they have been good at it in Tehran in moments, not just themselves, but also the militia networks they control in Syria and Iraq. There are 40,000 American troops in the Middle East right now. And when you look at past military operations against Iran, in 2020, during the first Trump administration, Trump ordered the assassination of Iranian General Qasem Soleimani, which then caused a retaliation from Iran. They fired ballistic missiles at American bases, and by a host and a string of miracles, no one was killed. They were intended to kill. This wasn't just a tit for tat, let's find a way to off-ramp this thing. It was, we're going to try to kill Americans. And an Iranian-backed militia sent a drone into living quarters at a U.S. base in Jordan last year and killed 3 Americans, wounded dozens of others. So it's important to take a step back and say, this isn't just bluster on their ability. They have backed it up with their influence and their experience in the region. They have done it before. The question is, how capable are they now that they've been stung by the U.S. and Israeli strikes over the past few weeks?
After the break, we'll talk about the risks of the U.S. getting further involved in another war in the Middle East and what could happen next. We'll be right back. So, Natalie, you wrote over the weekend that President Trump was making, quote, an extraordinary bet that he could destroy Iran's nuclear program without getting sucked into a long-term conflict. What would have to happen for him to get what he wants here?
Well, Iran would have to agree to end its nuclear program. And, as Alex outlined earlier, we don't really know how much of their capabilities were completely destroyed. Of course, they've been set back. That's the kind of language we heard from J.D. Vance on Sunday when he was talking about what the ramifications were.
I think that we have really pushed their program back by a very long time. I think that it's going to be many, many years before the Iranians are able to develop a nuclear weapon. But again, our goal is that they're never able to develop a nuclear weapons program. And that is.
But even, besides Trump, even top officials aren't saying that they have a guarantee that the program is obliterated. And so, based on what we know from history, it's probably not going to be easy to get Iran to agree to not have any enriched uranium remaining. And so what we would have to see is that they would have to agree to put that up. That was the condition from the U.S. side going into this that Iran refused to agree with, was that there would be no enrichment of uranium. And it remains to be seen what they're capable of. But, for Trump to come out of this feeling like he was able to do this one and done strike and bring about world peace, as he is saying, and this strike would prevent further conflict. That's the messaging that's coming from the White House. In order for that to happen, Iran would have to get on board with these negotiations and agree to the terms that Donald Trump wants to set for them. And we don't see any indication thus far that that's something that they're willing to do.
Right. And Alex, if Iran doesn't agree to de-escalate and doesn't agree to disarm, Trump has said, quote, there are many targets left. So that seems to indicate that the U.S. could keep striking Iran. What does that path look like? What does that send us down?
Trump is a businessman, so he understands that negotiations aren't unilateral in one way when it comes to this. So there is not just a responsibility and a consideration for de-escalation in Tehran. It's also in Washington and in Tel Aviv. There are ways for every country to find off-ramps in the next few days and weeks. The posture right now coming from the White House is it's limited. It's directed at these facilities for the nuclear program, but maybe not. And that's a very precarious situation to be in. So it could just keep going up the ladder with every moment if the parties don't find a way to find moments to kind of stop, reassess what's going on, and how to kind of contain this thing so it doesn't go into a wider war. That's a lot easier said than done, even though it sounds pretty complicated. But those are the risks that once you start going down the path, it's like driving at night. You can only see as far as your headlights. And we don't know what's around the bend because, the enemy gets a vote. They get a vote in Tehran of whether they will continue instead of the Israelis, for that matter. So that's important to keep in mind.
It's one thing for Trump and the Trump administration to say that we're not at war right now, but does Iran see this as a declaration of war? Like, do they think we're at war right now?
What is war? If we bring ourselves to that philosophical question, when it comes to Congress, they would say this isn't war because we haven't said so. And, certainly going back to Iraq in 2003, they sure were anemic in doing anything about that in the run-up to the invasion and afterwards. So there's still open questions of legality. Is this allowed under the UN Charter? Is the U.S. party to this war, or is it a common defense? How are they framing this in the White House as a preemptive strike against what we know to be a threat from them, which, of course, they don't know. The intelligence needs to be scrutinized by the NSC, which is the National Security Council, the White House, the agencies, and also us, you and me. How we got into this in the first place in 2003 was people in our position listening to officials say, you don't know what's coming. This is bad. We got to prepare. We have reasons to do this. And then those vaporize really quick. And then everyone said, why did we do this? That's how skeptics like J.D. Vance and Donald Trump and Pete Hegseth are born, where the catastrophes of being so sure about what the U.S. was doing. That's how those people made their bucks, fighting the establishment. But we're in that same situation right now.
And during Iraq, it ultimately became about regime change, right? The U.S. trying to topple Saddam Hussein's government. So is that the ultimate goal here for Trump? He says that it's to take out these nuclear weapons. But ultimately, does he, and obviously Israel, want new leadership in Iran? Because that would indicate a bigger scope of engagement.
Well, the president has sort of put out some mixed messaging on this. Certainly his top cabinet officials, people like J.D. Vance and Marco Rubio, have been saying regime change is not the goal. And then as we see often with Trump, that he will come out some hours later and say something that seems to contradict that. And we saw him posting on True Social about if that's where things are headed, why shouldn't there be regime change? And then we saw Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt sort of coming behind him Monday morning and not exactly trying to clean up, but trying to clarify.
The president's posture and our military posture has not changed. The president was just simply raising a question that I think many people around the world are asking. If the Iranian regime refuses to give up their nuclear program or engage in talks, we just took out their nuclear program on Saturday night, as you all know. But if they refuse to engage in diplomacy moving forward, why shouldn't the Iranian people rise up against this brutal terrorist regime?
But, Donald Trump has not, at this point, suggested that the United States would go in and try to bring about regime change by force. That's not something we've heard from him. But I will note that there has been a bit of mixed messaging from some of his top officials going out and say it's not about regime change, to the president saying, well, if that's where things lead, if that's what the people there want, then why shouldn't that happen?
We know this, that there is no bomb that affects regime change that would require direct U.S. involvement on the ground.
Right.
U.S. troops taking over cities, going into places, holding terrain, forcing out the government, a la Iraq in 2003. You can't do it from the air. They couldn't even defeat the Houthis from the air, you know? Guys in sandals, launching, 50-year-old rockets, they couldn't defeat those guys despite their efforts. So you can't just snap your fingers and send in the B-2s and say, okay, now they're a democracy. So it's gonna require something that makes this operation look like small potatoes. And that increases risk for sure. And I also hope we don't get, we as in the media in Washington and others, don't get drunk off the success of this run. A fuel line problem, ejector seat malfunction, one plane getting shot down. These are the little things that could have turned us into a much different conversation than we're having right now.
And Natalie, we touched on this a little bit at the beginning of our conversation, but as myself, a longtime politics reporter, I can't stop thinking about the politics of this decision and the fact that Trump has campaigned for such a long time as a peace president. He wants to pull the U.S. out of foreign entanglements. The whole MAGA movement is about America first. This seems like the antithesis of that. And you've seen some kind of MAGA diehards like Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene, the Republican from Georgia, really criticize him over this action. Is this a betrayal of his MAGA base?
There certainly is a vocal faction of the MAGA base that are saying this is not what we signed up for. If you go into the live chat feature of Charlie Kirk or Steve Bannon or, Jack Posobiec on these conservative streaming platforms over the weekend, over the last few days, you would have seen a lot of very angry people saying, where's the Trump that we voted for? Where's the Trump who said, no more endless wars. I pledge not to send your sons off to war in the way that they were, 20 years ago. And so there are certainly people who are upset. At this point, there's no evidence that there is some irreparable fracture in Trump's base. His coalition, of course, is made up of some of these diehards who are consuming shows like Steve Bannon. But there are a lot of other people in the Republican coalition who got behind Trump in 2024, even more traditional Republicans who sort of came around to him, even though they weren't the biggest fans of him previously, who are very much in favor of the action he's taken. But we are seeing, a rift among some of those most vocal MAGA leaders. And I think it's still too early to say what's going to happen. I think it's still too early to say the young Trump supporters are not going to show up in the midterms because they're angry with him about this action. I think it all sort of depends on what the Iranian response is, and then in response to that, what the United States ends up doing. Is this something that's still ongoing next year when people are going to the polls in the midterms? And then after that, as Republicans are deciding whether J.D. Vance will be their nominee or someone else. So there's a lot to watch, and there's a lot that could unfold depending on where things go. But at this point, the situation is that there are some angry MAGA leaders and MAGA commentators. There are others who are very much defending the president. And at this point, I think everyone is sort of waiting to see where it goes from here.
And Alex, it's important to note that you're a veteran and that you served in Iraq yourself. And it's hard to not make comparisons to George W. Bush's decision to invade Iraq in 2003. I've seen a lot of people saying that this moment is reminiscent of that. So how is it similar, and in what ways is it different?
It was after 9/11, so it was a different political climate in the case of Republicans getting their way with national security. Unfortunately, there's a lot of similarities. The first of which is there is a Congress that does not seem willing or able to affect any pressure on the executive branch when it comes to shaping policy. They have the power, theoretically, to declare wars. I would say the feeling of this broadening discussion of intelligence and what comes next and the most dire picture taken feels similar. Just pulling some quotes from back then. We don't want the smoking gun to be a mushroom cloud. We don't know, but it's best to be sure. The idea of the preemptive strike. The Bush administration and his lieutenants throughout the cabinets, they all got on the same sheet of music about this is going to be worth it. This will be limited. This will be something we need to do because the alternative is such more severe than what could happen. That's what it feels like now when you have, again, anonymous intelligence assessments coming out either through the media or White House officials talking about Iran's desire to continue the nuclear program. I feel like given the last 20 years, we should probably be in the, show me what you're talking about. That's what led us, when you talk about a slippery slope, it starts with that. It starts with the feeling that this is inevitable. And that's how it felt in the last few weeks when everyone, including myself, started Googling, what is a massive ordnance penetrator? What is this thing that we're talking about all of a sudden? It just felt like we talked about how it could be done and what could be done with military force and with the tools that we have, instead of the why are we doing this? What cause and effect will happen in the region to civilians, to American service members, to our standing in the world, to the greater geopolitical consequences that are pretty fragile right now and pretty combustible. What effect will that have? And in the discussions now, so far, and the discussions in the lead up to 2003, it was, don't worry about it. We can have a singular vision of how this is going to go. And, we can control the narrative. And of course, that did not happen, with disastrous consequences. And what's been rattling around my brain, not just since Saturday, but just in this run up, that kind of feels like we're on a moving train that won't stop.
Well, thank you both so much for your reporting and for taking the time with us today. We will continue to follow this.
Thanks, Colby.
Thanks for having us, Colby.
Alex Horton covers national security and the military for The Post. Natalie Allison covers the White House. Later Monday, Trump posted on Truth Social that Iran had given the United States a heads up about its plans to strike a U.S. military base in Qatar. Trump said that no Americans were harmed and that there wasn't much damage done. He wrote, quote, "Most importantly, they've gotten it all out of their system, and there will, hopefully, be no further hate." Several minutes later, Trump posted in all caps, "Congratulations, world. It's time for peace." This is obviously a developing story. You can find all of our latest reporting at WashingtonPost.com. That's it for Post Reports. Thanks for listening. The tape you heard of J.D. Vance in today's episode came from NBC's Meet the Press. Today's show was produced by Laura Benshoff and Emma Talkoff. It was edited by Maggie Penman and mixed by Sam Baer. I'm Colby Ickowitz. We'll be back tomorrow with more stories from The Washington Post.